Join me tonight, Proverbs 15. Proverbs 15. I decided to forgo the marker board so I didn't fall into teacher mode again. Every time I have a whiteboard near me, I just instinctively start going into that mode. So I'm fighting it. Proverbs 15 tonight, and we are going to be halfway through it. So if you want to start, we're going to be there in verse 13. Proverbs 15, verse 13. I do want to recap really quick. We're not going to go through a full recap, but I want you to remember what we were talking about last week. The last 2 weeks, we were talking about the idea of how to get out of a spiritual rut. And a big part of what we talked about for the last 2 weeks is this idea that there are times where you have to change things in order to get out of a rut. You keep going down the same path over and over and over, and sometimes you're just stuck because you keep doing the same thing over with a different result expected, and that doesn't work. So we talked about that last week. We said if you're noticing that you're struggling with the same thing over and over, or if you keep going to the same spot and struggling, sometimes you've just got to get yourself out of that situation. So we went through, we said part of that is changing up your friends. Part of that is getting rid of bad friends. Part of that is changing up your environment. And so we spent a good bit of time kind of talking about where does your mind naturally go. It's funny, I'm reading a book right now, and it's called Contagious. And what it is it's the whole topic is basically why do certain ideas catch on and why do other ideas not? And it uses the illustration. It said, there in marketing is this idea of triggers. And it said, when you think about it, something like Cheerios is talked about way more than something like Disney. And they said, if you look at the numbers, Cheerios is actually a far more popular topic than Disney. And they're like, why? Like Cheerios is like the most boring thing you could ever discuss. And they said, here's why. At about 7 in the morning, if you were to check in on your social media and you were expecting someone to be talking about a subject, they'd be probably talking about something to do with breakfast. And they said, like, they've charted the numbers, and they're like, you see this weird spike in the conversation about something like Cheerios between the hours of breakfast where it spikes and then it just kind of tapers off because what are people doing? They are there eating breakfast and they are talking about it. As boring of a subject as breakfast is, all of these breakfast cereal, and then they said, but when do people talk about Disney? I mean, really barely ever. Because it just does, like, it's not something we're always doing. It's not something we do every single day. What is it? It's something that we do once a year, or Mylan is always doing. But that's the idea. Like, when it comes to certain topics, they only pop up once a year. But something like Cheerios, constantly at top of mind. And so what they were doing is they were saying, all right, as marketing is going, what are some of the ways you can take your product and make it triggerable like that? And so they used the illustration of, this commercial of a guy getting out of a shower and he slips on a shower mat and he bops his head and they're like, oh, make sure you have a shower mat, And he's like, that's a terrible commercial because nobody's thinking about it when they go to the store. They only think about that the moment they step out of the shower and go, I need a shower mat. And then they forget by the time they get to the store. And so what it is if you're thinking about, all right, I'm looking around my house, and I'm looking at the things on my wall, I'm looking at the things I read, those triggers are there that make you think a certain way. And so one of the things that we would recommend at camp is we would say, hey, you need to do your devotions at the same time you brush your teeth. Not literally the same time, but the idea of you have a rhythm. So you get up, you're showering, you're sitting there brushing your teeth, and just as kind of the next pattern, think about it. When you get up out of the bed in the morning, you probably do a similar routine every morning. You go through that pattern. You get out of bed, you put your slippers on or walk barefoot across the cold floor, and then you go get in a shower, and then you walk from there and you do this, and you go do this. And there's a rhythm, and you don't even think about it anymore. And so our encouragement was to say, hey, you struggle with doing your devotions? Slip them in during that time, so that way it just becomes part of your rhythm, and it's a trigger. You just go, what am I missing? And so I knew when I used to go and work at the escape room, I had a certain sequence of events I would do every time I got ready for work. I would have this certain key ring. Looks all like this one. In fact, the keys are still on here. But I would have a certain key ring, and I'd put it on my belt, and then I'd put a knife in my pocket, and I'd put a Leatherman in my other pocket, and I'd have everything laid out, and it would be just a ritual, and I could sit there and go, my hand feels lighter right now. What am I missing? The ring. Okay, boom. Okay, I'm ready. And you could almost physically feel I'm missing something here. And so those are the ideas that we talked about with the idea of, hey, you're struggling with a sin, you're struggling to get in a good spiritual habit. start setting up some of those triggers so that you remember, I need to do my devotions. I need to pray, and it needs to be something that triggers in your brain to go, I'm missing something this morning. I haven't done something. But there's a lot of times people are like, I'll just wait till later, or I'll just kind of do it between lunch. And there is no rhythm. And it's very hard to keep a habit if there's no rhythm to it. And so we looked at that over the last few weeks. We said, you need to make sure you've got the godly friends. You need to make sure you're getting rid of the ungodly friends. You need to make sure you're setting up those patterns and those traditions. And we looked at all of that, and then we ended with the idea of you need to take a look at the things that are dragging you down spiritually, and you need to get rid of them, even if they're good. Those things that are in your life that you're saying, every time I see that, it pulls me in this direction. You just have to get rid of them. But here's the other side of that coin. Because as you go further in Proverbs 15, you start seeing the language of delighting in the Lord as a focus. And I think that's something that we have to sit back and remember, because if you get here in Proverbs 15, and what I'm going to do tonight is I want to read through this as an introduction to this. And I want you to look for all of the language that talks about finding your delight in what God is doing. I want you to look at that here in Proverbs 15. Now remember, as we've looked through the book of Proverbs, it is not necessarily a narrative. It is a bunch of little pithy statements that are meant to be memorable. But I want you to notice all the language that has to do with a merry heart, happiness, delighting in, all of those synonyms. Notice them. If you mark in your Bible, it might even be a good idea to start underlining these because there's so many of them. And so let's just start here in Proverbs 15 and look at verse 13. Proverbs 15, verse 13. And it starts out like this, and it says, a merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance. So right there, we see our first kind of setup for this pattern. So we've looked at the one side of things you shouldn't do, things you should change, and now this is the idea of, do you actually find delight in the things God has for you? A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance, all right? But by sorrow of heart, the spirit is broken. Okay, that's good on its own, but I want you to notice the pattern emerge as you read a whole bunch of these in sequence. So I'm going to read them, but I'm going to start noticing, I want you to start pinpointing these joy-type passages. The heart of him that understanding seeketh knowledge, the mouth of fools feedeth on foolishness. So we don't see anything in that passage. It's pretty straightforward, but we'll come back to it. All the days of the afflicted are evil, but he that is of, look at it, a merry heart hath a continual feast. Okay, so we've seen it in verse 15, a merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance. In verse 15, the merry heart hath a continual feast. Now, we're going to see in the next verse that this isn't necessarily talking about food, okay? But think about the idea of you have everything your heart could desire. So you think about kind of your stereotypical feast, this banquet that's set before you, and it's just, you've got all the food you could want, you've got the delicious desserts, you've got the delicious drinks, everything that you could be satisfied with, and you're going, this is wonderful. Like, I have the peace and safety enough to enjoy this. Spiritually speaking, that's what this is talking about. And it's not saying it is literally, you will always have a continual feast of food. Because look at the next verse. Better is a little, okay, so you notice it just came off that verse on continual feast. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great trouble and treasure therewith. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox with hatred therewith. And so again, it's just these little notes to say it's better to not, remember we kind of half joked about that verse. It's better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a broad house with a brawling woman. You know, and so if you've ever been with someone who's a fighter and a yeller and a screamer, you're like, I'll take my closet. And the Bible is kind of saying, like, you're kind of better off having the little bit that you have and being happy with it than having more than you could ever desire without satisfaction. So I want you to notice all of these verses have something to do with where we get our pleasure from, where we get our delight from. Okay, so that's verse 17. But then look at this, verse 18. A wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth strife. So even that word appeaseth kind of has the idea of there's some pleasure to be had here. Because you think about it, if I've appeased you in some way, you were angry, you were strife, you were fighting, and now it's resolved. And there's a level of peace, there's a level of release to that. All right? I don't know if you've ever been nervous about something. I remember years ago I was traveling up to Willow Creek, California, And I was on a mission from a guy because he needed a sign from a Bigfoot bookstore. I know, I go on random quests, all right? But it was a friend of mine who runs a museum, and he wanted that sign for his museum because he collects Bigfoot memorabilia. I know, it would never surprise you. And so he said, hey, I've gotten permission from this guy. Can you go get the sign? People are already looting the store because it burned down. I'm afraid the sign won't be there, so I need you to go up as quick as possible and get it. And so we drove, and it's about a 4-hour drive to get up to Willow Creek. And so we drive up to Redding, and then you cross over through the mountains, and you're getting to that bookstore. And I'm telling you, there was like a nervousness in my gut, because here we are driving multiple hours to see if this sign is still there. And I'm going, I don't know if it's going to be there or not. Like, we could drive all the way this way, and it could be completely pointless. I mean, it's a very scenic drive. It's very pretty. Don't get me wrong. But it could all be for naught. And you got that nervousness in your gut of like, I don't know if this is going to succeed or not. And there was just something refreshing about pulling into the parking lot of that burned out bookstore and going, the sign is there. And then you pull the sign off the wall, you feel like you're stealing something, but you had permission, but you still feel nervous because you're like, yeah, this looks fishy. And you pull the sign off, you put it in the back of the car, and you drive over to the nearby town and you mail it out. And it's just that relief of going, okay, nailed it, done. And you still have that little bit of nervousness. You know, you have that nervousness of like, will it survive a cross-country trip to Maine? And you go, I don't know that it's going to survive, but that's not really my problem, but it kind of is. And then once it finally arrives and the guy sends a selfie with the sign and you're like, ha, good, it's now none of my problem. But what is that? That's the idea of appeasing. It's like, it's done, it's solved. I was really nervous and kind of like itchy going into that, and then it's like, resolved. And so you understand there's a level of pleasure there that comes where you're going, hey, here's a guy who is slow to anger, and he appeaseth this strife. He's putting this strife to bed, and it's done, and it's over with, and now we don't have to face that problem of living in a closet. It's done. We're at peace. You know, and just, again, it's just all these different ways of saying, what are you delighting in? What are you finding your pleasure in? Hey, do you find pleasure in these things? Now you keep going, verse 19, it says, the way of the slothful man is a hedge of thorns. All right? Okay, so you might not see the pleasure in this one, but if you've ever had to deal with blackberries or anything like that, and you've tried to push your way through a clump of blackberries, and you understand how it pulls and tugs, you understand the frustration that comes when you have to clear out that. And that's what it's saying. It's saying this guy who's lazy and slothful, it's like he's stuck in a thing of blackberries. It's just frustrating. And again, we used to have blackberries at camp, and there was something just satisfying about when the grounds crew got to the blackberries and they would carve a channel through them, and you could see these beautiful little trails going through the blackberries, and you're like, that's just a nice plain trail. I don't have to worry about anything tugging at my legs. I don't have to worry about scars. I don't have to worry about pain. I remember one time I was using a machete and I was cutting back the blackberries, and I cut a thing of blackberries and it swooped up and it landed on the back of my neck. And it somehow had poison oak in it too. So then the back of my neck broke out with like poison oak and hives and all the stuff from the, and I was just like, oh, this is pleasant. And you can see like that's the idea here where it says the slothful man, his way is a hedge of thorns. But then look at the other side. But the way of the righteous, what? It's made plain. If you've ever walked through kind of an open field and there was nothing bristling at you, there was nothing grabbing onto you, it was just nice and open, and you're like, this is nice, this is pleasant. And so what are you seeing here? You're seeing all this language about things that we can find delight in. And I want you to notice this, because again, he that is slow to anger, he appeaseth strife. The way of the righteous is made plain. You go to the next one. It says, a wise son, what? He maketh a glad father. I don't think I need to explain why glad ties in with delighting, but anyway. But the idea, it's glad. Now again, any of you who have kids, you understand the difference between a child who's doing right and the joy that brings, and a child who's doing wrong and the grief that brings. And that's what this verse is saying. That a wise son, someone who's doing well, will not only bring joy to himself, but he'll bring joy to his family, his parents. And it says, but look at this, but a foolish man despiseth his mother. Okay? And again, it's that contrast. And as we look at these proverbs, if you ever doubt what it means, just look at the other side, and it's a complete picture. And it's either emphasizing or it's reversing it and giving you the other side. But you see all this language here. Now, keep going, verse 21. We can also find our joy in things that are wrong. And so what this is this is trying to point us toward that which is good and say, find your delight and find your joy in that. But understand that there is, as the Bible says, joy in sin for a season. I mean, the Bible says that. It says there is pleasure in sin for a season. It looks at Moses, and it says Moses said, there is a level of pleasure that comes from being a prince and being royalty, but it's not worth it in the long run, and so I am going to turn away from that pleasure in sin for a season, because it will bring pleasure for a season, but it won't bring lasting pleasure. And so what does Moses do? He comes and he goes, I'm going to be willing to give up. And that's where he gets it. And so you look here, it says, but their folly is a joy to him that is destitute of wisdom, because he doesn't see what's going to come next. But a man of understanding walketh uprightly. Okay? Now again, we're going through these proverbs, and we're taking the time, and I want you to see all this language of pleasure that comes out of this. Verse 22. Without counsel, purposes are disappointed, but in the multitude of counselors they are established. Okay? That is a language of pleasure as well. There is a pleasure that comes with success. There's a pleasure that comes. I remember years ago, it was right before the 2008 stock market crash. And I had a guy who was trying to get me to take my money and invest it in his little brokerage firm. And I dragged my heels a little bit, and I was like, you know what, I don't think I really want to. Honestly, I was just being lazy, but it worked out for me. And I just didn't go through with it. And then the stock market completely crashed, and his firm went out of business. And there was something satisfying about going, I left my money where it was, and I still have my money. Whew. And there was something pleasurable about that, to say, I didn't make that decision, and I didn't lose everything. I am very, very happy I did not make that decision. And that's where it's this idea. If you're living wicked, and if you're going after these things you shouldn't go after, there is a disappointment. There is a frustration that comes with that. That is the opposite of pleasure. Okay, and it says, but in the multitude of counselors they are established. Verse 23, again, it comes right back to the language of joy. A man hath joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season. How good is it? That encouraging word, that word that just hits you, and you're like, that's it, I got it. That's the type of thing that brings joy. Verse 24, the way of life is above to the wise, that he may depart from hell beneath. And so it's kind of that contrast of heaven and hell. And it says, hey, the wise person is this guy who's living the heavenly life, and it protects him from living the hellish life. And it's kind of that contrast of pleasure versus pain. Verse 25, the Lord will destroy the house, I don't know where that accent came from. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. And here's the thing where you can actually find joy in an otherwise unpleasant situation. So he's saying, here you've got the border of the widow who's losing out and who's suffering, and what do you got? Her boundary lines are protected, but God is reaching out there and he's destroying this guy who's proud. Again, it's this idea of protection and again, the pleasure. But verse 26, the thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant words. So again, the way you can use your tongue can be pleasant. Verse 27, he that is greedy of gain troubleth his own house. He that hateth gifts shall live. The heart of the righteous man studieth to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things. So you're just seeing all this language about how to use your tongue. Verse 29, the Lord is far from the wicked, but he heareth the prayer of the righteous. And then we get back to very direct language about pleasure. Verse 30, the light of the eyes rejoiceth the heart, and a good report maketh the bones fat. Okay, here's just a really fun little sciencey tip. I don't know that they knew this back then, I'm assuming. But it's funny how much language is used about fatness in the bones. And that's actually where some of our white blood cells, red blood cells, that's where some of our health comes from, is the bone marrow, which is found inside the bones, and it's kind of fatty looking. And so it's just interesting how they use that language of health and survival and blessing, and it's all this language of fatness in your bones, you know, and it's just kind of a neat little side note there. But he's saying, if you live right, if you're doing things God's way, if you're going after, there is a rejoicing that comes to the heart. That the Bible would say that there is peace that passeth understanding. And you've been there probably. I mean, I know there was a time where I was going through car trouble, job trouble, health trouble, all that at once, and yet there was just a peace that passed understanding. And it wasn't this peace that was like, oh, I just know that every decision I make is right. It was just a peace going, I know that I'm right with God, and I know He's got this taken care of. It was just a peace that passed understanding. It did not make sense that when everything seemed to be going wrong, I could go, I'm just trusting the Lord in this, and I'm actually at peace. My heart is comforted. Now, was it nerve-wracking and was it stressful? Yeah, that all came. But there was something about this pleasure and satisfaction that you could go, I know God's got this. And I don't have to sit here and fret. And there was this health, and there's this rejoicing of the heart. But then we'll just finish off the chapter here, verse 31. The ear of him that heareth the reproof of life abideth among the wise. He that refuseth instruction despiseth his own soul. But he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. And so again, it's just a whole lot of random little proverbs, but I want you to notice that because look at all interspersed throughout that little section of Proverbs 15. Constantly coming back to the idea of pleasure, coming back to the idea of delighting in what the Lord delights in, coming back to delighting in what God has said. Now, we're going to spend some time, Lord willing, next week digging in deep elsewhere in Scripture. But let's summarize what we just read through, okay? Because I hope you can take this type of study and apply it to yourself and say, okay, I'm going to take a section of Proverbs, and I'm just going to look through and see if I can find a theme that's being borne out in Proverbs. And sometimes it's hard to do. Sometimes, like literally, I copy-paste the entire section, and I just go through and I look and I see if there's any connecting threads. And like I said, you don't always find them. Sometimes Proverbs is a narrative. It's just straight up like, boom, this is what it is. It's a story. And so that's pretty easy to discern. But as you get to a thing like this, you're noticing we kind of started halfway through Proverbs. We started halfway through this chapter. The first half of the chapter kind of had a different theme. If I wanted to do a whole study on the tongue, I could have taken several verses from this and just left the rest out. But what you can do is you copy-paste a whole section, and then you just look at it and go, oh, look, there's a word for pleasure. There's a word for pleasure. There's a word for pleasure. There's a word for... That's interesting. And you're going to start seeing this connective tissue that kind of runs its way through. And it's almost like as the guy was writing down a whole bunch of Proverbs, he just had on his mind, how do I delight in the Lord? And how do I make sure that I'm delighting in the right things? And then he just started writing down proverb and proverb and proverb and proverb and proverb. And we know that Solomon took his time, and we know that Solomon collected proverbs from all over the place. And so you know that Solomon is thinking this going, all right, I got this proverb that ties in with how I use my tongue, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. Okay, cool. Okay, that ties in with the heart, and boom, 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 boom. And you'll start to notice these patterns. It's not just random. Like Solomon did not take 7,000 proverbs from around the world, write each one on a sheet of paper, and then just throw them out and go, okay, where did they land? Cool. We'll just arrange those however they landed. Like under the inspiration of God, Solomon is collecting all of these proverbs and he's putting them all together in a way that makes sense. And that's why you start to see this beautiful little connective tissue when you look for it. So let's make some conclusions and we'll open it up for questions tonight. So here's the start. First of all, verse 13 is telling us that it is possible to delight in the Lord. It is possible, and I know there's times where it becomes humdrum and it becomes normal and it becomes just what we're used to. I mean, you think about the first time. I remember I was at the Highland Games, and I went up and there was this soda dispensary, and I walked up and there's these big kegs, and they had birch beer. And again, I'm at the Highland Games and there's kegs, and they sold metal cups, and I'm going, is this alcoholic? And I was like, no, it's soda. It's just straight up soda. They just home brewed it. And I was like, whatever that means. Okay, I'm telling you, first time I ever had birch beer, which is a soda. I know it's got the word, it's like root beer. It's just made of birch. I don't know. But anyway, it was delicious. It was like the best thing ever. Like it was like, this is awesome. Like I will come back to this event to get that drink one more time. But then once you find it in like bottle form, and you find it everywhere, you're kind of like, it's not as exciting anymore. Now I still like it. I still collect the bottles, but it's not as exciting though. And you probably had that with something in your life where the first time you did it, you were like, this is great. And then as you've done it 300 more times, you're like, I can take it or leave it. And so what he's doing here in Proverbs is he's saying this idea of happiness and satisfaction and finding delight in the Lord, as you read through this whole passage, it is possible still. It is possible to get back to that point that you can delight in the Lord. And here's some of the ways to do it. Some of the ways to do it are choosing how you live. Some of the ways to do it are choosing what not to say. Some of the ways to do it are saying, I know there's temporary pleasure over here, but long term it's going to hurt. I need to choose this way. Those are all the things. And so the first thing we understand, just looking at this, is a merry heart is possible. Now, by looking at some people in our world, that does not seem logical. I don't know if you've ever run into those type of people where you're like, I'm happy and I know it, clap your hands. You're like, tell your face. And there's that person that's like, I worked with someone like that. Like every time I'd see him, I'd be like, hey, how's it going? And they're like, it's good to see you too, man. Happy day. But some people, they don't seem to understand that there is still the possibility to be merry. There's still the possibility to be happy in the Lord. And when you've got that burden and you've got that sorrow and you've got that suffering, it weighs you down to the point that you don't feel that anymore. But the Bible is saying, hey, you can still have a merry heart. Verse 13 and following. Verse 14, this merry heart is connected, and as we just kind of progressively walk our way through the text, we don't quite know it yet, but we saw it because we read the whole text. But there seems to be a connection. If you truly want to delight in the Lord, it's connected to living wisely. It's connected to living the way God has told you to live. And I know this sounds silly, but it's almost like God knows exactly how we're wired, and he knows exactly how to give us lasting pleasure. He knows. Like he says, okay, I know because I designed the chemical dopamine, I know what will give you a temporary hit. And I also know what will be satisfying in the long run. And God is laying it out for us going, hey, if you're foolish, you're going to go after this thing for that temporary hit. And if you're wise, you're going to go after this thing for a lasting satisfaction. And he's warning us, like all throughout, he's warning us against those things that draw us away for temporary hits. And he's saying, don't go after those. And so as we see in verse 14, the heart of him that hath understanding, what? He seeketh knowledge. But you'll notice the verses on either side of that have to do with joy and satisfaction. That's not buried in the middle for no reason. It doesn't say, a merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance, and a merry heart hath a continual feast on either side of this verse. It's buried in the middle of that for a reason to say, this is how it works. That's how it is. And so there are times, like if you've ever gotten a piece of technology and you're looking over the instruction manual and you find this random little sentence and you're like, that makes no sense in the context of what I'm looking at. Sometimes it does once you've read the whole thing and you go back and you go, that's why you told me to put that wire there. Oh, I get it now. But when you don't understand, that wire going into that spot, you go, I don't get why you just told me to do that. And it's like, just trust the process. And that's what he's doing. In verse 14, he's slipping that little wire in to say, just remember that for later. All right, so verse 13, a merry heart is possible. Verse 14, it's tied somehow to wisdom, knowledge, or righteous living, somehow. Verse 15 through 19, a merry heart is not gotten through stuff or position. We talked about that plenty of times in this study. But what he's saying here, verse 15 and following, is he's saying, look at all the things you could go after that provide a temporary hit. That's not the secret. And so verse 14 just kind of hinted it, showed a little behind the scenes to go, just so you know, it's going to take a little bit of study, but it's not that. And that's what you see in 15 to 19. He points out the things that don't. But then look at verse 20. And anyone who's ever sat with Martha understands this, that merry hearts are contagious. I don't know about you, but there are just certain people you're around that you're like, it just rubs off, and you just can't help but smiling. And so look at this verse, though, because it's saying that a wise son maketh a glad father. But the other side of it is a foolish man despiseth his mother. And so the idea is you have, with your lifestyle choices, you have the ability to bring joy to the people around you, specifically your leaders, or sorrow. And you've got that. There's this idea of this contagiousness. And again, it has to do with the way you're living. It has to do with the choices you make. It has to do with the lifestyle. And it's saying, hey, a wise son, a man who's living the way he should, there's going to be an intense satisfaction that comes to that person's parents. But if you choose to live unwisely, you're basically despising your parents. And that's what he's saying here. You then keep going, verse 21. It says, folly is a joy to him that is destitute of wisdom. So what do we see here? There is a fake merriness. There is a way to get satisfied and have fun in a way that is not legitimate. I'm sure that comes as a surprise. But what is it? It's a fake merriness. It's the guy who is a fool, and he can find joy. It's not a joy that lasts. He can find satisfaction. It's not a satisfaction that lasts. But look what it is. Verse 21, the man who has understanding, he's going to walk uprightly because he sees the end destination and says, I'm going to walk in a way that gets that. All right? As we wrap up, look at verse 27. Sorry, verse 23. A man hath joy in the answer of his mouth, and the whole rest of this section is all having to do with your tongue and all the right timing of things. And so, again, there is a connection between satisfaction, delight, and doing it in the right time. And you see here in this language, as we went through Proverbs 23 to 26, the idea of a man hath joy in the answer of his mouth and a word spoken in due season. It talks about a man living for that which is above, not that which is in hell. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the wicked. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the righteous are pure and pleasant words. And it's all this idea of the right timing, waiting on the Lord, and letting him do some things. And that's how this is established. And so you see a connection between delighting in the Lord and waiting for his timing, doing things in the right way. All right, verse 27 brings out this. There is a grief that is contagious as well. So you see here in verse 27, he that is greedy of gain, what? He troubles his own house. So he's not just troubling himself, he's troubling his house. And so a wise son is going to have an effect on his parents. But he that is greedy of gain is going to have an effect on everyone around him too. And so the way you choose to live is not isolated to you. It has a cascade effect. I think of the story of Achan. What happened with Achan? Yeah, he stole all this stuff that was not his to take. He was part of the battle. That's what you did during battle. You took the stuff. Achan knew better because he hid it. And his family knew about it, and they didn't do anything about it. And guess what? He troubled his own house, and they all died. And there was a pile of stones left there in the valley of Achor because they said, that's where the guy troubled his own house. And so again, you see even in this language, it's the idea, it's almost like Solomon had that story in mind where he says, hey, if you're greedy of gain, you're going to trouble your own house. And you even see it in the story of Korah. What do you see with the story of Korah? You see a group of guys who go, hey, we're all princes, we're all noble, we can all go to God. How dare you set yourself up over us? And what does he do? Moses goes, well, the Lord chose me. I'm going to let the Lord fight for me. And so he says, if the Lord has not chosen me, all of you guys will die a normal death. I'm just warning you. If you don't want to be part of that, you might want to get as much distance between you and them as possible. And that's what Moses does. He says, if these guys die a normal death, I'm not chosen of the Lord. And a whole bunch of people from Korah get away from him because they end up writing some of the Psalms. The sons of Korah are still alive as of the book of Psalms because they write some of that music. But the rest of the sons of Korah and Dathan and Abiram, they stuck with him and they said, no, we think we're right. And God goes, I hate to break it to you. And the ground opens up and swallows them all down, and then that's the end of it. And so if you are greedy of gain, which in both of those stories they were, you trouble your own house. They brought that upon them. And so again, there is fake joy, there's fake pleasure, there is sometimes delayed pleasure. But again, as we wrap it up, verse 27, again, there's a connection between having the right focus and having the right joy. Verse 27, he that is greedy of gain troubleth his own heart. But again, what is it? The heart of the righteous studieth to answer. He waits, he thinks about it, he pauses. The prayer of the righteous is heard by the Lord, but the Lord is far from them that are wicked. And so again, there's this connection between doing things the right way and finding satisfaction. And then the last 2 verses is this idea: there is grief on those that choose their own way. And so it starts off with the idea of joy and a merry heart and a merry countenance, but we understand as you go all the way down through that list, you're seeing this interspersal of right joy and wrong joy. And it comes all the way down, and it gets to the end, and it says, oh, by the way, if you refuse instruction, you're basically despising yourself. And if you hate reproof, you're not going to hear understanding. You're not going to know what to do. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. And so again, it's subverting some of these ideas to say you got to put yourself down to get where God wants you. And it's just some really beautiful little passages here. So I wanted to unpack that as we introduce the topic of delighting in the Lord. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at other passages outside of Proverbs and see this throughout the Scripture. But again, if you're in a spiritual rut, you look at the things that are dragging you down, you say, I'm going to stay away from those. But you can't just get rid of everything and go, I'm just going to sit like a monk and never enjoy anything. But now when you turn away from that, you're putting off, now you're putting on. What are you putting on? You got to delight in the right things, and this is telling you how to do it. And so like I said, Lord willing, we'll unpack that next week. Not next week, 2 weeks from now.